Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. This next presentation will be on reforming age cutoffs, and our presenter is Professor Govind Persad. Govind Persad is an assistant professor of law at the University of Denver Sturm College of Law. Professor Persad's research interests center on the legal and ethical dimensions of medical resource allocation, health insurance, healthcare financing, and markets in healthcare services, as well as professional ethics and the regulation of medical research. He has published law review articles in venues including the George Washington Law Review, Emory Law Journal, Boston College Law Review, Yale Journal of Health Policy, Law and Ethics, and American Journal of Law and Medicine, as well as medical and bioethics articles in venues including JAMA, Science, New England Journal of Medicine, The Lancet, American Journal of Public Health, Journal of Medical Ethics, and the Hastings Center Report. Professor Persad has also authored op-eds in the New York Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, and USA Today. He has also appeared on NPR's Morning Edition, Colorado Public Radio, and other local and national news outlets. He was a 2020 through 21 University of Denver Public Impact Fellow and serves on the advisory committee for the university's Scrivener Institute of Public Policy. He is the recipient of the 2022 Barack A. Brody Award in Bioethics and a 2018 through 21 Greenwall Faculty Scholar Award in Bioethics. In addition, he was selected as a Health Law Scholar in 2017 and as a BioOp Scholar in 2018 by the American Society of Law, Medicine, and Ethics. Professor Persad earned his PhD and JD from Stanford. Professor Persad clerked for the Honorable Carlos Lucero, U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit, and was a junior faculty fellow at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business. He then spent 2 years as an assistant professor of health policy and management at the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health before he joined the Denver Law faculty. We really appreciate you being here today, and you can go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm sorry that today I'm a little bit under the weather, so I may not be as energetic as I normally would be, but I will try my best. So this piece is one that actually really grew out of some work that I was doing with colleagues actually around COVID-19 policy, where we were interested in a problem that was coming up where setting age cutoffs that defined a minimum age for access to vaccines was tending to disproportionately exclude populations that were more disadvantaged in various ways. So we're tending, for instance, disproportionately exclude a lot of populations of color, populations in poorer areas, because life expectancy in those groups often was lower. And so I started thinking about, more generally, does having these minimum age cutoffs where you have to be live beyond a certain age in order to receive access to a program, what is the effect of those sorts of cutoffs on the access and the fairness of programs that are defined using these cutoffs? And I noticed at the time that I started writing this, there was a proposal to shift the Medicare eligibility age from 65 to age 60. So this is a big part actually of President Biden's campaign proposals. Now this looks sort of unlikely to happen given everything that's happened since then, but in the end, it didn't actually end up being included in the final Build Back Better bill. Then that bill ended up not proceeding forward. But in the course of thinking about that, one implication that seemed really interesting was that not only would lowering the eligibility age for Medicare to 60 bring in more people, it would also improve the program's accessibility to people who tend to have shorter life expectancies or tend to need medical care earlier in life. So they need more medical care at 60 as opposed to 65. So I'll go to the next slide, and this sort of walks through some of the different programs where you see these age cutoffs used. So the most prominent one that I started out thinking about was the The Medicare program, which as we all know, has and now continues to have this age cutoff at 65 for access, outside of a few exceptions, such as, say, people with end-stage renal disease who get access based on their medical condition rather than age. Another big program where age cutoffs are certainly used is Social Security, where people can gain access to Social Security earlier by reducing their amount of benefits they're eligible for as early as 62, but can receive full access generally at 66, and then if they wait until 70, can actually receive greater yearly benefits by waiting. So it's interesting because if you are able to live longer and have the resources to be able to wait to start taking your Social Security payments, that actually increases the quantity of benefit that you get from the program. Beyond these two big programs, there are also a variety of smaller programs that use age cutoffs. So there are in many states the work requirements associated with receiving SNAP food assistance. Those stop for people above 60. And some states are allowed to have demonstration programs that allow the provision of cash instead of SNAP benefits for people over 65. And then you also see these age cutoffs used quite a bit for housing assistance programs, where age 65 or some older age is often used as the basis for access to, say, help paying for heating or cooling costs, or automatic tenancy protections for people who are in rental housing. You might wonder, why were these age cutoffs used initially? For Medicare, we have, and so I guess for Social Security, actually, we have a little bit of understanding of that, which is that the Social Security Administration at least claims that the reason why 65 was selected initially was just, they say, primarily pragmatic, rather than based on any firm normative commitment about where the age cutoff falls. At that time, many state pension systems also used 65 as an eligibility cutoff. And then using 65 for Social Security, it's gone up to 66 now, was thought to produce a manageable system, basically balancing revenues in and payments out. They said it produces a manageable system that could be made self-sustaining with only modest levels of payroll taxes, which are the taxes used to fund Social Security. And so it's then likely that the use of 65 at the time in Social Security formed the basis for its being used in Medicare as well. And it stayed at 65 even while the Social Security, quote, full retirement age has gone up over time. So that's the best understanding I think I have of why the age cutoff ends up falling at 65 for Medicare and 66 for Social Security. And then I think the use of, say, 65 in many other programs often follows from its use in this, this big program. Beyond the benefit programs, you also have certain grant opportunities, such as the Senior Volunteer Corps, that actually, this program interestingly defines seniors as everybody over age 50. So it has a different cutoff from the programs mentioned before. There are also similar grant programs for volunteer activities by seniors that also define age cutoffs. And then there are also uses of age in population level measures of need for various services or for funding. So for instance, in some states, in New Jersey actually, applications to construct subsidized housing, they judge that on the basis of what proportion of the area population is 70 or older. Other states do similar things for nursing home beds. And you actually see federal funding for what's called the Area Agencies on Aging program being distributed among states, not just by population, but proportionally based on the population of people 70 plus. So that implicitly uses 70 plus as a population level cutoff. Then you also see the use of age cutoffs and tax benefits. So if you are 65 or over, you receive an additional tax credit and deduction. People over certain ages are also allowed to make larger contributions to various tax advantage retirement accounts, and to withdraw contributions penalty-free from other accounts. And at the local level, you also see many states and localities provide more generous homestead exemptions, property tax exemptions to people who are above a certain specified age. Then last, these in some ways seem less consequential than certainly eligibility for Social Security or Medicare, but I thought were also quite interesting to see is that various governmental services are often offered at discounts or for free to people over a certain age. So transit fares, many types of fishing licenses. So in Minnesota, for instance, if you make it to 90, residents 90 or older may take fish without a fishing license. You see a lot of similar rules actually across other states as well. I don't see one here for Virginia, but there are quite a few. New Jersey has an exception for people over 70. Arizona has something like this as well. So you might wonder, sort of having walked through these, what the how these sorts of age cutoffs relate to the purposes of different programs. And so this frames the question of, what are these programs for? So, and again, I'll take sort of Medicare here as an example because it's a big source of spending and also a major benefit. Medicare's goals are multiple and often not sort of spelled out perfectly clearly. But some, all the Medicare's enabling statute says is that it provides basic protection against the cost of hospital, post-hospital home health services, hospice care for various individuals, but doesn't explain why it provides this protection or why it limits the protection to older adults. But some commentators have tried to fill that gap by looking at what they think the purposes of the programs are. So some have understood it in what I call egalitarian terms. They say, well, the point of Medicare is to ensure that folks who are older receive healthcare that's not materially different from the healthcare that people otherwise in the population receive. Others, instead of thinking about it as equal access, think about it as a safety net program that protects against poverty or to protect households against impoverishment due to sickness, or to help older people obtain medical care they couldn't afford otherwise. Then you have still other people that see Medicare as being fundamentally a cushion against economic shocks. So protecting households and spreading the financial risk of medical care expenses across the wider population. And then last, some actually see it as a way of incentivizing hospital and other public investment in providing care to beneficiaries. So if people, Medicare confers buying power on this population, this incentivizes investment in meeting their healthcare needs. So I'll think a little bit more about this now in terms of considering the purposes of benefit programs more generally, and this draws on some work in tax policy. So we might think that, and here I'm going to try to identify the fit or the divergence between using age cutoffs and the purpose of various of these programs. So one goal that I think often seems like the core goal of these programs is to benefit people and prevent harm, to make people better off than they otherwise would have been. And so you might think age cutoffs are justified by the aim of benefiting people because being older is associated with being more medically frail or being less wealthy. So it's a good way of proxying for people who can benefit more from a program. think there are some problems with this in that age is an imperfect proxy for frailty. There are many people who are younger than a given age cutoff that may have more major medical needs. And you also see increasingly, in part maybe because of the success of programs like Social Security, that it's not clear that being older anymore is a strong proxy for being poorer. This was true historically, say in the 1970s, but is not true anymore. So older people are not generally poorer than younger people, and it's especially true once you look at wealth rather than just income. You've seen poverty among older adults actually drop down, while child poverty and poverty in younger adults has stayed high. So if you are using age cutoffs in the hope of proxying for wealth, it would be better to use some other tighter proxy, like eligibility for other income-based programs, rather than trying to use age as that kind of proxy. The next purpose that programs might have, and this is one where I think there's more tension, is the purpose of remediating disadvantage that people face. So not just to benefit people, but in particular to benefit people who are facing more disadvantage. This corresponds with, in tax policy, people who talk about the goal of vertical equity. And the problem here is that people who are disadvantaged in various ways, disadvantaged by poverty, by structural racism, by factors like unemployment, these all tend to shorten life expectancy. And so this makes it harder for people who are disadvantaged to reach those minimum age thresholds for program eligibility. And so this is a fairly substantial tension between age cutoffs and the purpose of addressing disadvantage. So if you look at the age 65 cutoff, for instance, if you look at the demographic information about the population of the US, people over 65 are much less likely to be members of various racial and ethnic minority groups than people under 65. People over 65 are also more likely to own their homes. They're less likely to presently be in poverty, and they're less likely to have been in poverty earlier on in their lives. Even though we've seen some changes in the demographics of people over 65, we've seen unequal distribution in gains in longevity. So you've seen much bigger increases in longevity in more economically advantaged groups, whereas more disadvantaged groups remain facing much still shorter life expectancies. So for instance, only around 80% of men in the US actually live to age 65. And people who die before age 65 are much more likely to be from various groups that are disadvantaged in certain ways. Another program purpose might be what scholars in tax policy call horizontal equity. So treating equals equally, essentially. And one tension related to sharp age cutoffs is that you might think a 1-year difference in age shouldn't warrant being sort of completely excluded versus included in a program. So you have a very sharp distinction between being just outside of program eligibility and just within. You actually see differences across programs with respect to this, because Social Security has a bit more of a phase-in, where you can receive some benefits at 62 and then receive more benefits the longer that you wait. Whereas something like Medicare, there's no way of buying into it before 65, no matter your life expectancy or how much you may have need for the health services that program provides. The last value that might be thought to be served by age cutoffs is a value of sort of recognizing and rewarding past individual choices, or allowing individuals to have a greater menu of choices. And there are a couple ways that I think age cutoffs end up being misaligned with these goals. So one is that age is an imperfect proxy for past say, economic contributions. So you already see in Medicare and Social Security the incorporation of employment history, which seems like, if you care about past contribution, probably a better proxy. And then additionally, with respect to recognizing sort of enlarging choice in the future, age cutoffs are going to tend to favor what I call a normal life plan, where people work for many years, sort of up through middle age, and then are absent indefinitely from the workforce in retirement. And it's less good for people who pursue life plans of other kinds. So people who spend more time earlier outside the workforce, or who go in and out of the workforce because of caregiving or other responsibilities. So the age 65 Medicare was originally imagined as sort of transitioning people from being consistently covered by employment-based insurance into being eligible for government-provided health insurance at retirement. And the issue is that as workers now are tending to change jobs many more times during life, facing more unemployment, say in middle age, this Medicare age cutoff picture may no longer be such a good fit for this, this program goal. So what are some of the options? Before I get to options for going forward, just say a little bit about some of the practical constraints on what reforms might be adopted. So one reason why minimum age cutoffs get used, and this came up quite a bit in debates around COVID-19 as well, is that minimum age cutoffs might seem attractive because they're simple. So something like just saying, well, you get Medicare if you're 65 is much simpler than basing it, say, in the way that how much you pay in taxes is based, where you have a more complex set of evaluations. But it may be possible to have tests that are fairly simple while still not just being age-only tests. So some work I did with colleagues around vaccine policy looked at whether, if you combine age with other factors, say geography, you can actually get policies that both generate more benefit and address disadvantage better, say varying the age cutoff based on the geographic location in which a person lives. Another reason why you may have these age cutoffs is budgetary constraints. So using an age cutoff is going to make it more predictable how many people will qualify for a program. In contrast, if you have a cutoff based on economic or financial need, during a economic downturn, you'll then see greater eligibility. And this is likely to actually better address disadvantage and provide more benefit, but it also makes the budgetary needs harder to predict. Additionally, depending on how you define the age cutoff, by pushing it further upward, you can further reduce the fiscal burdens of the program. And you've actually seen this used to argue for sort of raising the eligibility threshold for Social Security further and further. Some people have argued that as life expectancy becomes longer on average, we should push Social Security or Medicare eligibility ages higher. What I'll talk about in a bit is that this is likely, as we've mentioned before, to have a real tension with addressing disadvantage, because living to an older age is going to be highly correlated with being more advantaged. So if you push the eligibility age from 65 to 70, that may reduce the budgetary pressure on the program, but it's likely to exclude disproportionately people who are more disadvantaged. The last reason why you may have these age cutoffs is political feasibility. So one thing we know, at least in the US, is that we see increasing propensity to vote with age. And so conferring benefits based on age may be something that fits well with political goals. But again, here it also fits uneasily with addressing disadvantage, because we know that being disadvantaged not only leads to living less long, but also often leads to being less likely to vote. So that's another factor that may play a role in the selection of various age cutoffs. So what are the reform options that are possible for some of these age cutoffs that we see in programs? So one option, and this is the option that was discussed for Medicare eligibility, is obviously to shift the age cutoff downward. So say shift the age cutoff for Medicare from age 65 down to age 60. And this would bring more people, and disproportionately as well, more people who are disadvantaged into the program. But it would also bring just more people into the program. So it would increase potentially the program costs for these programs. Now, one difference between the COVID-19, say, vaccine allocation context and social insurance programs is that if you allocate scarce resources using an age cutoff, shifting that cutoff down is still going to involve competition within absolute scarcity. If you shift the cutoff down, that worsens the odds for the people who were further above the old cutoff. In contrast, for a social insurance program, you don't necessarily have that absolute scarcity. And so you might even have overall societal advantages from shifting that age downward because of the benefits of, for society, of having more people be able to participate in a program like Medicare. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the other factors that might have favored adjusting age cutoffs downward. So one reason that might favor, one question that may come up is, if you adjust them downward, how far down do you adjust them? And this depends on looking empirically, for instance, at are there ages where people are more likely to become unemployed and then struggle to access adequate and affordable insurance, say, in the individual health insurance marketplace. And there's evidence that this holds true into earlier middle age, but might not necessarily be true for people, say, in their 40s. Another factor that I think favors moving the cutoffs downward earlier is that you're also likely to see spillover benefits within communities. So if you shift Medicare eligibility to people in the early 60s, this may also benefit people who fall even below that cutoff by freeing up household resources, say for spouses who are below even the lowered cutoff. May also benefit children, in that people, if you should say the cutoff down to 60, may be more likely to either still be direct caregivers or to be grandparents who are primary caregivers for kids. And so I think you're likely to see indirect community benefits from this. And you actually saw, despite it not having in the end passed, you saw in polling popularity for moving Medicare eligibility down to 60. Because in general, you may see political challenges if a policy is mobilized against by a well-organized group. But actually, for Medicare at 60, many groups are likely to see that favorably. So employers and insurers may view it favorably because it'll shift insurance costs for these populations, say 60 to 65, off from them, and also allow them to offer insurance at lower prices to customers who fall below the age cutoffs. People below the age cutoff, they might still be disappointed to be excluded, but they aren't any more likely to push back than they would have been against Medicare at the current cutoff. And they may benefit from the lower cost of health insurance, from removing older folks from that risk pool with them. So overall, Medicare at 60, I think, had the political promise of imposing a fairly diffuse burden on taxpayers more generally, while assisting a group that's fairly well defined, these people between 60 and 65. You saw some people worry that incumbent over 65 beneficiaries will be led to believe that bringing more people into the program will reduce their benefits. But people just below 65 in the group that would come in are often very closely connected to those just above 65, often say maybe spouses or family members. So in that respect, I think Medicare at 60 might actually have been better positioned politically than broader programs like Medicare for All, both in terms of not involving costs that are as high and extending eligibility to a group that is closely tied to current Medicare beneficiaries. Another option, which I think you see in Medicare for All, it's my second bullet here, is the option of eliminating, getting rid of age cutoffs. That again would also address disadvantage and would increase the number of people who could benefit from the program. Could also get rid of some of the other concerns about you have no horizontal equity problem if everybody is eligible, and you also widen individual choice. The relative merits of eliminating versus adjusting the age cutoffs is often going to depend on, what is the availability of other sources of benefits at specific ages? What is the sort of path dependence of those programs? And then a further option that could be used is instead of eliminating these age cutoffs, one could combine age with other factors when determining program eligibility. So for instance, you could set eligibility at different points in geographic communities that have different life expectancies. So you saw this for vaccine eligibility in COVID-19, where sometimes people in counties with shorter life expectancy were proposed or was actually achieved to give them earlier vaccine access. And you actually see some state regulations that use a similar approach for funding, where they look not just at the population above a certain age, but you look at other demographics. So the Older Americans Act, for instance, says an area receives funding based on its overall population of people above 75 and its population of residents in racial ethnic minority groups who are over 60. So this sort of combines these two metrics. The other thing that could be done in combining age with other factors is you could replace these binary cutoffs with, as I talked about earlier, a sort of phase-in process where people can receive increasing benefits over time, just like what you see in Social Security. So potentially you could see this for Medicare, where maybe people could start buying in earlier on and then could bear a higher share of the premiums when they buy in earlier, but the government bears more and more of the premium until when you reach the sort of full eligibility age, the premium drops the current level that people who buy, say, Medicare Part B or Part D are asked to pay. The challenge for some of these approaches of combining age with other factors there could be sort of political or administrability challenges. So if you base it on geography, geographic areas tend to be fairly heterogeneous. So a zip code that has long life expectancy on average may still have many disadvantaged people with shorter life expectancies. You could address this by instead looking at the life expectancy of the shortest lived, say, quartile or decile of decedents, or looking at smaller geographic areas like census tracts. Also, if you use geographic criteria, you have the challenge of classifying people who move between zip codes, because your lifespan is likely to be more driven by your zip code earlier in life than necessarily your zip code during retirement. Another way, I've talked about geographic targeting, you could also have eligibility ages combined with employment or economic status. So you could have, for instance, eligibility connected to work in certain industries, where if you worked in a higher risk and lower wage industry, you would become eligible for Medicare sooner than others would. Or if you worked more quarters earlier in your life, you could be eligible earlier. And you actually saw this traditionally as a practice in certain fields that are considered highly burdensome or risky, where early retirement was sort of a part of the benefit package. I mean, you still see it for some public sector occupations like firefighting, say, but you could see it potentially under reform for some private sector occupations as well. The last option is you might replace age cutoffs completely, but not just eliminate them to allow everybody in, but shift to a period of eligibility time. So some commentators, for instance, have talked about a model where for every 2 years that you work, you get 1 year of retirement. So eligibility for retirement benefits would be more like eligibility for paid leave. You would earn these benefits, then be able to recoup them at a time when you choose. And a challenge for this approach, I think, an attractiveness of this approach is that it does allow flexibility. So you can decide when during your life you'd like to receive access to a program like Medicare or other forms of public support that fosters various types of life plans. But it's also, I think, harder to implement because individual life expectancy is unpredictable, and there's this risk that people may outlive the benefit period. This brings up an interesting feature of social insurance, where social insurance in some ways is Medicare and Social Security, at least, are sort of provision of insurance against what's actually a good outcome, which is living longer, as opposed to other forms of insurance against bad outcomes like becoming ill or having an accident that destroys your home or car, or being liable for such an accident. Interestingly, even though people would find it generally much better to live to 100 than to live to only 60, it would seem still, I think, to a lot of people, untenable to say, well, if you got to 100 and you've used up your period of eligibility time for this program, even the person who living to 100 is a much better outcome. I think this is a practical challenge for the idea of shifting age cutoffs to periods of eligibility time. And you saw some of this is pushed back against some suggestions that you saw actually during the pandemic of letting people shift some of their Social Security benefits to support paid leave earlier in life. So allowing people to basically dip into their Social Security earlier to cover some paid leave costs. So I will go ahead and stop here, and I see that there'll be about 15 minutes for questions. So thank you all so much. So see one question in the Q&A. I don't know if I should answer them specifically in the Q&A. Somebody asked, what impact has the COVID-19 pandemic had on the idea of reforming age cutoffs? And then also asked about, is there an impact from people staying in the workforce longer? And this question is from Tara Christensen. So I think it's interesting because with the COVID-19 pandemic, I think certainly for a period of time, there was quite a bit of attention to the fact that minimum age cutoffs were disproportionately excluding more disadvantaged populations. But I don't know whether that impact has continued today. I sort of don't know, for instance, it'd be really interesting to sort of be a fly on the wall and see, what it is that led to Medicare at 60 being excluded from the ultimate Build Back Better package, even before that package ended up not proceeding forward. I think the flip side is that to the extent the COVID-19 pandemic has put pressure on public funds, maybe there's less willingness to reform age cutoffs to broaden access to programs because there's a worry about spending. So I think, for instance, a big reason why there have been challenges in Build Back Better moving forward was that there started to be a lot of concern about inflation and concern about whether spending was driving inflation up further. And even though it's not clear to me that access to Medicare earlier would necessarily have that sort of effect, I do think some of the knock-on effects of the pandemic may have made it harder to have these kind of legislative reforms. Yeah, I think if people are staying in the workforce longer, in some ways, this may reduce some of the pressure to reform age cutoffs, because one of the attractiveness, one of the big attractions of Medicare moving to 60 is being able to have access to for people who become unemployed in later middle age and really struggle to access insurance through the ACA marketplaces. So if people are staying in the workforce longer, then I think that reduces some of the pressure toward age cutoff reform. So thank you so much for those two great questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Persad. We actually have a few more questions. And one of them is, you mentioned a phase-in process as an option for reforming the age with Medicare, where people could start buying in earlier on. And this person is wondering if there's a certain buy-in age that could make this more successful. And do you think it could be successful?
Great question. So yes, some of this is going to depend on, sorry, I'm just getting my camera back on. Some of this is going to depend on whether a given age, what the sort of costs are of allowing buy-in at that age. So probably the lower you shift the buy-in age, the greater and more substantial the amount of payment you'd have to make for the buy-in would be, because you have more people who are eligible to do that. So in some ways, it may be sort of an actuarial calculation. I think the other picture would be sort of trying to predict how many people would buy in at a given age. I don't have a specific answer. I think it's really going to be a kind of actuarial calculation looking at how many people would be likely to buy in and what the health costs of that population would be.
Absolutely, thank you. And then we have two more questions here. Another one is, do you think there are any other factors besides geography that could be incorporated along with age cutoffs that would be more successful than others?
Yeah, so one thing I talk about in the piece, this has been interesting, given some sort of recent court decisions, is so I think the factors that seem obvious in terms of trying to address the concern about age cutoffs failing to remediate disadvantage would be, I would say, probably looking at, there are probably others, but something that come to mind for me would be looking at age plus economic disadvantage, looking at age plus factors having to do with medical frailty, and then also looking at age plus race. I think legally there are going to be challenges for using age plus race at the individual level, because you would need to pass strict scrutiny, and I think it's going to be very difficult. You've seen a lot of programs fail by having individual racial classifications where courts are going to say, well, race is not a perfect proxy for disadvantage, and so say having Medicare at 60 for people in populations, say, that have shorter life expectancy, even though it might make sense from a public health perspective, is going to be unlikely to fly with courts if that eligibility is based on race. I think if it's based on, there's not going to be that problem if it's based on economics or on medical frailty. I think there's been the challenges for medical frailty. You do see this already, although not combined with age, for conditions like ESRD, or people who have qualified for supplemental security income for more than a certain amount of time. I think that's promising. I think that might involve some of the same challenges administratively as things like Social Security disability, where if you had to have external judgments of medical frailty, that could be challenging because not everybody will have the same resources to show that they're medically frail to be able to access these programs. So geography and economics are somewhat easier, I think, in terms of being legally unproblematic and also sort of more practically administrable. So you could almost have a sort of, by allowing, say, earlier access for people who are poorer, almost a kind of Medicaid hybrid, as it were, where people are allowed to access Medicare earlier based on a rationale that you see more often for something like Medicaid, which is based on economic disadvantage.
Great, thank you. And then it looks like we had another question come in based off of that. And they're wondering, how would you set the standards for medical frailty?
So I think this is challenging, and I think that one way of doing it would be to look at the same kinds of factors that people look at when making things like SSDI determinations. Because you'd want to look at, are there people who would have a difficult time participating in the workforce and the sort of full-time jobs that lead them to have access to health insurance. The other might be to also look at, and sometimes you already see this for certain conditions, are there people who have medical conditions that present very high medical costs, where it may make sense for them to be shifted into a program like Medicare? And you've seen this again with the ESRD program in Medicare, where people with kidney transplants, for instance, or on dialysis get shifted into that program, which I think simplifies their payment and also reduces the sort of unpredictable financial pressures on private insurance that you would have otherwise. So I think, ideally, instead of having these sort of ad hoc condition by condition, you'd want to look at, what is the universe of conditions that involve these really high costs, and maybe use that as a basis for access. And the further question you might have is, do you combine that with age, say access if you have this costly condition and are over a certain age, or do you just make it universal for people who have the condition that tends to lead to very high health costs?
Great, thank you. And we just had one more come in. And this question is, how, if at all, do you think the increasing traction of Medicare for all interacts with your argument to reform, reduce, or remove age cutoffs?
So I think it's really interesting. I am not sure about the premise of the question, because I'd be interested in whether there is actually this increasing traction of Medicare for all. I think there are two different ways that it might go. One is to say that Medicare, moving the Medicare age downward could sort of lead to being a sort of trial run for moving it downward further, where eventually you get closer to something like Medicare for all. The other worry that people might have is they may say, well, this is going to reduce the momentum for Medicare for all, because people who are covered by Medicare at 60 or 50 or 55 won't have the incentive to lobby for access for people who are even younger and sort of below that level. My sense is that, at least in the polling, was that Medicare at 60 was a lot more popular than Medicare for all. And part of the reason why may have been the difference in the amount of tax revenue that would have been required. So I think part of it is going to be a political determination about which sorts of programs are feasible.
And this is going to be the last question that we have time for. And it kind of goes off just what your answer was. And could you elaborate more into what legal issues could be faced by combining age with other factors? And do you think that these legal issues would be more challenging than the reduction in simplicity that you mentioned by just doing it based off age?
So I think really for geography or economics, they're unlikely to be major legal issues, because those are not sort of protected class criteria. So even if they're imperfect proxies, you're not going to see, I think, successfully really a lawsuit from somebody in a geographic area saying, well, I'm disadvantaged, but I live in this advantaged geographic area. The only exception would be, and there's actually recently a Virginia decision about this, which is new, and we'll see how it goes on appeal, is if it looks like geography is being used as like a proxy for race. There's a recent decision about schools that concerned this in Fairfax, I think. But beyond that, I think with economics or geography or medical frailty, it's unlikely to be legal issues. I mean, medical frailty there would be if you were discriminating against people who are medically frail, but in expanding their access is unlikely to generate any legal issues. I think the place where you would see this legally would be for race. So there were some commentators who said, well, we should make it for vaccines that if you are a member of certain minority groups and you are 60, you get access, and if you are 65 and you're white, you get access. And I think there are ways in which, again, from a strictly public health standpoint, that makes sense looking at the risk curve for different groups, but I think would be very, very unlikely to satisfy the sort of strict scrutiny requirements that courts since the Adirondack Parents Involved decision have put on use of race. So I think race is the one where individual beneficiary race, where I think you would have the greatest likelihood of legal risk.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Persad. That was wonderful and very interesting. Govind Persad's accompanying paper, Reforming Age Cutoffs, is forthcoming in the University of Richmond Law Review Symposium issue. We're going to take a brief break now, and then we'll be back at 4:15 for a presentation by our very own third-year law student, Madison Harrell. She's going to be talking about expanding maternal Medicaid coverage postpartum. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.